Welcome, Chris. So great to have you here. I just want to fill our audience in a little bit on your background so they have a sense of you, as I do already. Just Chris and I went through the show last week together, and I loved doing this because it's always great. You know, as an art historian, we know stuff, but then when you go through with an artist, you can have different things, questions and ideas that come through, and it was a real treat to go through with Chris. I enjoyed it so much. But just to give you some details about his background, Christopher Bassi is an Australian artist of Miriam and Yupang, say it for me.
Yupangathi.
Thank you. Apologies.
Okay.
And British descent.
Yeah.
And he graduated from the Queensland College of Art in 2017 with a Bachelor of Fine Art, and his first solo show, Documents of Distance, was held at Stable Art Space in 2018. And selected group exhibitions include Future Proof at Box Copy, Cross Mending at Outer Space, The Garden and the Sea at the Milani Car Park, and his work is held in a number of private collections as well as the Museum of Brisbane. And you can see his work right now in the City of the Sun, which is an exhibition at the Museum of Brisbane, which is pretty perfect for thinking about place and space. So that's another wonderful show going on at the moment, as well as Torres Strait Island Futures at the Queensland Museum. So we also visited Chris's work at the City in the Sun exhibition last week, which was another real treat. So clearly we have the right artist for speaking about the theme of place. And I think Chris's work is really informed by place and belonging and how racial and cultural identities intersect. And his art aims to highlight some of the complexities of contemporary cross-cultural experiences. And he is very interested in European paintings, and that's something we're definitely going to explore today. And painting as a practice, I think is really, and tropical flora is a recurring theme and subject in Chris's paintings. So that engagement with painting, plants rather, as portraiture, I think is crucial. So let's welcome Chris, please. It's great to have him here.
Everyone.
And I'll toss up. So I think probably a really nice way for us to get going, Chris, is by thinking about your heritage, which is in part Torres Strait, specifically Mare Island. And when we met, we talked about how gardening takes a priority there, and it's in your practice as well. And I think that's something we evoked with this Monet painting. And can you tell us more about how and why plants matter to your practice and your heritage? Just say all of that.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. And I'll just begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land that we're on, the Turrbal and Yuggera people, and pay my respects to them, past, present, and emerging. I was born here in Brisbane, but my family matrilineal heritage is from far north Queensland. Murray Island, Mare, the Miriam people from there, and Yupangathi, which is like up near Weipa in the Cape. So whilst I was born here, I'm here still as a guest, and I always acknowledge that I make work here and I prosper here, so I'm very grateful for that. But so I mean, we finished off on this work, and it kind of touches on a lot of things that I think about in my work, really. I mean, I really think about the garden, but also its domesticity. I think the way that I come to some of the themes that are in my work in terms of my heritage, the Torres Strait is such a long way away, and whilst I get to visit that and visit family there, a lot of the way that I experience that or think about that is via distance. So this idea of the garden is a place at home, but it's also a place that's culturally significant for Torres Strait Islander people as well. So we're seafaring people, but also living on the islands, it was very important that gardens were maintained, and there's a link there to, to labour and work as well. And really, when I think about it, I think about a garden that's at my studio, which is at my family house. And I also think about a garden that's in the Torres Strait at my grandmother's house as well, and just the way that those two places are connected in some way. I think that.
Do you cultivate the garden that's at your studio? Like, when I was talking about Monet, diverting a river to create a certain look, I mean, is that something?
I think the garden's a bit of my mum's thing, because it's at her house, But, I do love gardening. But I think touching on what you were talking about, that cultivating, and it's a throwback to the way that I really think about painting. There's a sort of theatricality in that, the staging of something, and this idea of looking at a thing and us through time looking at a painting like this and thinking that we're seeing something maybe without thinking that it was perfectly placed or it was cultivated or there's something else happening there. And this idea of painting for me is really about a place for ideas. A painting of a thing is not the thing itself, it's the idea of that thing, and the artist's hand in that has a really significant place in that whole process. And as a painter and as someone that's really interested in European paintings, I often think about what the artist is doing and where they're from and their story, and then reflect on the way that influences me, or the way that my story can come through a particular type of painting that is often seen through one specific lens over another.
Do you like thinking about process when you look at works like these, or is it more about that kind of emotive? Do you know what I mean? Because I'm sort of there saying, okay, when we look at this, we have to think about how Monet is cultivating his garden, and maybe that's not necessary to appreciating and enjoying, but I know that some artists do like to look at other artists and think through their process sort of carefully.
I think my interest in painting is par and parcel with the history of painting as well. I think that engagement is a sort of question for me. It's what does it mean to make a painting today? What does it mean to have Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander heritage and paint into a medium that has a context, has its own history? And so, I'm thinking about both those things, actually. So I'm thinking about a sort of technical aspect of painting, trying to figure out how a painter might have performed a particular thing, how a painting sort of gets constructed. And that's just as important as, the final image. I mean, some of those things that you mentioned in the lecture about, I think it was a Raphael, how he'd sort of changed an image, or painted over and moved the chalice, and it's those sort of things that are part of the process that sort of change the whole dynamic of something. I think we spoke about, I read an article that just popped up that a Vermeer painting, The Milkmaid, had they'd done some x-rays on it, and there was actually this huge painting of a cherub in the background. And I mean, that stillness and silence it's that totally exists in that painting. And it's a painting about light now, but it would have been completely different if there was this huge painting of a baby angel in the background. So
it's such a perfect example, because
perfect.
It's completely changed the interpretation of that work, because stillness, letters, and now there's this angelic figure sort of, and mythology interrupting this Protestant anyway. So it's a great example.
But I mean, that's the painter, that's the author as well. So I mean, I'm very much engaged with the history and the stories that the authors have, the painters have themselves. But yes, I mean, I'm a painting nerd, so I love having the opportunity to go and see works here that I've only ever experienced via the internet or on screen is completely different and sort of profound for me. I kind of get exhausted walking through that show, because I've spent so much time just trying to figure out how to make a painting, really. And I suppose technique's not something that's really it's not so much of an issue these days, but I suppose for me in my practice, I kind of make it. I make it that, because it's an engagement with these kind of paintings that I'm interested in.
We did spend a lot of time looking at single brush strokes
Yeah.
in the Velasco's. We're like, oh, look at that. And so, Chris was great to think about the show. I thought I'd throw these up because, I ended my talk on these, and just thinking about that connection between self and a place, which is so important to your practice, or like a relationship between land and people, the sea and people, or even just an environment as part of identity. And thinking about, I suppose, the problematic nature. I mean, we touched on this in our discussion last week. We talked a little bit about Gauguin and the worries there. And I was interested to hear your thoughts on his palette. Actually, I thought that was really evocative. So I don't know if there was something you wanted to throw into the mix here.
Yeah. I mean, this is a good segue into the way that I kind of think about my work. And I think that, this idea of home is very present. This idea of elsewhere is, to an extent, not the same sort of way that Gauguin would think about elsewhere as like an othering. There's maybe a space in between there that maybe I exist, where I feel as though I'm thinking about home from a distance.
Right.
Maybe not being in that space all the time. I think, part of my process has been going up to the Torres Strait or far north Queensland and being there, but often, that work takes form as reference imagery, and then I would make work back here in Brisbane. So it's never like a direct response to a thing whilst I'm looking at it. Yes, the Gauguin is something that we could talk for a long period of time about, and that's, that history is there, and I guess, I could segue into the history of an Australian art, an Australian way of looking. I think my engagement with painting in particular is an interest in an engagement with Australian history and a particular history of European vision in the South Pacific, or in the way that Australia has been looked at by Europeans from colonisation, and it's gone through a scientific lens and then into this lens of at the turn of the century, or like turn of the 20th century, this selling of the idea of Australia, the bush as, the bush as quite a scary place in the beginning and unknown, and then the bush as this place of opportunity. If you go into like an Arthur Street and work or something like that, this idea that the landscape was used to sell this idea of Australia to England or to Europeans as a place of prosperity but my issue with that is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are sort of nowhere to be found in that sort of history. They're there in the beginning as objects of study, and they kind of get pushed further and further into the background. Like I think of like a John Glover painting or something, they're just like figures in the background, and then they kind of disappear altogether. So like an engagement with painting specifically, for me, is an engagement with that history and a way of sort of thinking about what it means to speak to that history, how it means to paint into that history, and to tell stories of place that belong to me and like, my country or like my family. And
we talked a bit about sort of flora and fauna and that European lens there, and how in those early depictions of, say, a kangaroo, it's shown
quite obscure and like not quite right. And I think what we were talking about in colour in terms of the Gauguin is like, I've seen those colours. They do belong to the tropics, the wet tropics, and but not so fantastical, you know? So I think that's something that he's doing, is kind of taking this other place that's already new to him and sort of taking it all the way to another fantasy world, and that's kind of his engagement with the space as well, and that's the problematic side of it. Whereas like I see that yellow in a pawpaw, or like, in a mango, or, and that's just the way that the light hits a tree or something, and that's a very painterly way of looking, because you're thinking about light and sort of surface, and so that's my crossover from that into an Australian history, which is what my engagement is, what keeps me interested.
So let's look at some of your work, Chris, which I love this idea of the portrait of a plant, and that was something we talked about as well. And this wonderful work, which is up in the Museum of Brisbane right now, in the City in the Sun exhibition, which you can't think of a more rigorous interrogation of place than City in the Sun, and thinking about Brisbane as a space and place for creating. And I love the title of this work too, Shade from the Sun, because when I think of palms, they don't give very good shade. And that, I think, when the early European, they came like, the gum tree, this is a useless tree. It doesn't give us the shade we need for our picnics and stuff. But anyway, this work here, I mean, the portrait of the plant, I just speaking to this and why it matters, and this as a work evocative of Brisbane.
Yeah, this was a commissioned work from the Museum of Brisbane, and asked me to respond to this idea of City in the Sun. And it is a flow-on from the way that I sort of have been thinking about place and specific vegetation, and sort of like thinking about where am I and what makes this place different to other places. And this is a response from my studio in the western suburbs of Brisbane. I actually have lots and lots of these Alexandra palms around, and it was just a reflection on like a particular palm. I actually climbed the roof of my studio and took a photograph, a bit front on. But it's a connection of connecting this place here to further north, to the Torres Strait. I think I often think about, I've been to lots of talks like that architects have had before about trying to contextualise who Brisbane is, what's our identity. And I think I actually just got back from Cairns last night, and I think that's something that I think about is, we're in the tropics, we're like on the borderline. As soon as you go north, you start getting a bit hot and wet, and that's not only contextualising sort of Queensland, but starting to contextualise our place geographically in the world. This idea that we're part of the South Pacific and we have a sort of Pacific history. And, we think of ourselves as like another European sort of centre, but like we are in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific, and these icons are there as markers for us to sort of like think about. This idea of, we touched on landscape painting, but I don't ever think of myself as painting landscape, and I think that might be something to do with that distance as well. And also it's just not really something that I... like I mentioned, it's more of the idea of the thing. So it's more of like an artist in the studio's engagement with an idea rather than being out in the wild, sort of like thinking about light. And so like the idea of, another thing about this work, it's quite large on the screen, but like it has a presence. I painted it. It's about 2.5 meters by 2 meters. So when you stand in front of it, it's about sort of being sort of engulfed by this palm, which is a sort of perspective that I've never really seen. I've seen palms in paintings before, and they're kind of they're there or they're small and they sort of respond to the environment. But this idea of just like falling into or being like absolutely surrounded by this idea, this icon, and the shadow is another something that I add to a lot of my works. It's just as much a painting about light as it is a painting about a palm, and that shadow it's a bit of a non-space. It's a bit of a space that exists like in a studio space. It's not like out in the world. I think about how I bring these ideas into the studio and sort of respond to them. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing there as well.
Well, and that idea of like the composed,
the theatre
of it, and that's something that are, Claude Lorrain and all those, they do their sketches, but then they compose it in the studio, and it's like the plant is, in action, is acting out a part or something. Is that?
Yeah, it's very much taking the role of a sitter. Which is completely different to like just sort of experiencing it in the world. And that's my engagement with painting and being a painter as well. And like painting is a way for me to think about the world and engage with the world. And my biography is sort of entwined through all these works. And so some of them are very personal spaces. And like to paint something is quite a meditative thing. You spend a lot of time with a thing, and and that's part of it, that's part of my process, and what sort of drives me to make work is that sort of time that it takes. And that in and of itself is a theatre, to make a painting, to construct a painting, to make a painting, to gesture with paint. That kind of performance is something that is part of the whole practice, really.
And I loved when we were looking at this work together in person, and you were noticing these the
drip
kind of
marks,
the drip lines there. And, there it is. That's paint.
Yeah.
That's paint. And I love hearing you talk about your process and your approach to paint, because it's not necessarily a medium that is wholeheartedly embraced in the contemporary art world. If you think it's and so that's excellent. Like as just an advocacy, hearing you as a cheerleader for the medium, a medium that's been proclaimed dead over and over again. We're finished with painting. We're finished. Here it is. A vibrant contemporary artist engaging wholeheartedly with it. So
I mean, that's what makes me so excited about a show like this, is that I get to sort of see those that theatre, in these works that I sort of that I love. It comes from a place of love as well. But yeah.
Let's look at another work by Chris, Grow. A densely foliaged pawpaw tree. And again, this idea of the portrait of the plant. What can you tell us about this one, Chris?
This work was, so the other work was taken from an image from home here in Brisbane. This was based on a trip. I went up to see some family on Thursday Island, and then went to Moa, and my uncle there had a number of pawpaw trees that he was growing, and we ate pawpaw for breakfast every morning, and Moa's so isolated. I mean, there's the local shop and things like that, but everybody sort of is fishing and sort of self-sustaining in some capacity, and and so this sort of pawpaw just became a memory of that place, really. But also an intensity of the light and the green that you see in far north Queensland, a colour that is just really vibrant and almost kind of fluoro in a sense, but when the light hits a piece of fruit at the right hour, or it just glows like that. And again, the non-space it exists in is a reference to pulling it back from that space, that idea, that memory, and bringing it into the studio and thinking about it and meditating with it and understanding what my connection is to it, a particular climate, a particular place. Yeah.
Fantastic. And then we have this wonderful series where, thinking of portraits of plants and now portraits of people, in this series in which you're meshing sort of movement between, the sea with the shells, land with the fruits, with, the portrait of your mum. Can you talk us through this one? It's very evocative.
This series is a bit of a truncated version from a show that I had earlier in this year called The Garden and the Sea. And it was a kind of meditation on a lot of different ideas that have been coming up in my practice over the last, over the number of years that I've been sort of practicing. And I mean, the pearl shell is something that's I've used continuously as a sort of way to connect with a particular history in the Torres Strait, the history of pearl shell, pearl diving, and the way that that's kind of impacted and sort of changed my family. I mean, my family, the Torres Strait has such a unique history. It has such a diverse cultural history. The history of a lot of Japanese, a lot of Chinese, a lot of Indonesian, a lot of Indian sailors had come through, and a lot of Torres Strait Islander divers and Aboriginal divers as well. And there's been power dynamics in those relationships, and me just trying to think about the way that that's affected my family through stolen wages and lots of histories that are a bit complicated, and also, this idea of the shell. As you walk through that show, there's quite a few paintings in there that have the pearl shell, or sort of a lady wearing a pearl earring, and they take on a different context through a European lens. They take on this context of the exotic or the sort of riches of travel and voyages, and that's just not something that it means to me. That shell that's there, I have like a number of them at home, and they're from the Torres Strait, and Mum puts them up all over the house as a reminder for her of that place and that history. And I'm interested in the way that like icons or sort of like tropes of like tropical or the pearl shell and the exotic are sort of seen through one lens by Europeans and seen through another by family or people that sort of live and belong to that place. And so, the pearl shell is emblematic of labour and history, and the way that my family has sort of, I've got family from lineages from Sri Lanka and from Chinese, and it's like if those things didn't happen, I wouldn't be here today either. So it's a way to sort of contemplate my place in the world, or like sort of all the sort of things that have happened for me to sort of be here today and sort of make it work, and like it sort of embodies that. So I mean, the shell's something that comes up, and each of these sort of belong together as a way. I mean, the show's called The Garden and the Sea, and it's very much about the Torres Strait and the way that, as I mentioned, Torres Strait Islanders are seafaring and people and gardening people. And I often take a role in my work. So like the self-portrait, or what would be considered a self-portrait, is kind of a performative thing as well. It's an engagement with the history of portraiture and what it means to sort of represent yourself, represent your story. And it's something that I'm really conscious of when I make a painting. So, I spoke about the history of representation in Australian art, the history of representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And, when I make these paintings and I'm making them in this way, I'm very conscious of who I put out into the world and in what context. So it's a slow process for me. It's something that I'm comfortable working with myself and trying to understand that, as I grow as an artist. And this was an important body of work as well, because I started to introduce my mother into the work as somebody to help me tell that story about who I am. So it's her hands for the beginning, but they all kind of speak to a kind of fragmented way that we sort of exist in the world, or how we take images on and we make sense of the world around us. It might be an object, it might be a hibiscus flower at home, it might be a mango tree in the Torres Strait with with a particular light, and all those things sort of create us or create me, So that's sort of how this work came to be.
Perfect segue to our next work.
Hey.
The Black Palm.
Yes.
And I love the juxtaposition of this. It's great.
Yeah.
It's great. So talk us through this, because this leads brilliantly into one of the works in the Met show that we want to talk about together. But tell us about Black Palm. So
again, this is so obviously an engagement with the history of painting. For me, I'm thinking I am looking at these large portraits of people, historical figures or stories that are being told, and I'm thinking, how do I get into there? How do I tell stories in there? These four sides of a painting is a space. It's a theatrical space, and you can take it anywhere. And it's about, for me, pulling from tried and tested ways of working and saying, it can be those things, but it can be this other thing as well. So, the black palm, the black palm as a species is something that's pretty important to culture up in far north Queensland. It's used for weaving. It's used for the centre of it's used for some spear making. And I just sort of took that idea of a black palm. I mean, the black palm's not actually black either, but it's this theatricality that I'm interested in, this staging. So I was like, what does that black palm character look like, if he was to be embodied? And so I actually created a prop of like a fake palm plant that I painted and staged myself. The yellow canvas in the background is actually the canvas that the final image is painted on. So it's kind of this sort of like throwback to the artist in the studio, as well as a very, very much a place where ideas are brought in and sort of played around with and sort of experimented.
You do like Velasquez.
A bit of Las Meninas or something. Yeah. And I mean, it's a play on scale as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's what paintings do. They push you back. I mean, there's a theatricality in the way the viewer views a painting. You're brought, I mean, in there's a huge Rubens that you have to sort of take in from afar, and then there's a very small, I forget the artist of the Madonna and Child, that's quite small.
Oh, the boats.
And they're kissing.
Yeah.
And you have to go right up close to that and see that, like, you know, and that's the sort of like scale play that I'm sort of thinking about here. And I mean, it's just
Oh, true, yes.
the palm on the right-hand side, your left. Right? No,
Right.
my right. You're right. Sorry, you're right. I'm looking at the palm on the right. I mean, it's just hanging into the canvas as well. So it's also a gesture to something that's happening outside of the work, and maybe that's actually a kind of cinematic thing. That's kind of like like the show must go on or something. You're just seeing like a little bit of the show here, and there's something else elsewhere as well.
Or
so
like an isolated fragment. Because
Just a
something I
little
talked about
fragment,
too is
yeah.
like how things have been chopped up, and
That's
sometimes
right.
what we're seeing isn't actually exactly the whole thing. That's like this little, fragment.
just a little fragment,
Just a
you know.
yeah.
Just
Well-
yeah.
Shall we throw up the next slide
Sure.
to think about some models for your black palm?
Yeah.
Because I think I really, really enjoyed looking at these with you and you talking about the theatrical elements and props. And I mean, these are two just phenomenal works in the show. We're moving away from plants, but we're still thinking like portraiture of plants, and these kind of children with these props and playing at dress up and their theatricality, and kids love doing that, and in a way it's something we lose a little bit of as we age.
Not me.
Me neither, Chris. So just engaging with these, and actually, I keep saying you love Velasquez. We'll look at a Velasquez portrait in a minute, but just thinking about that, your engagement with that European art history is really fascinating, and some.
Yeah, I mean, I love both these artists. I mean, I look so intently at their work to try to, again, it's a figuring out of a technical aspect of their work, and also figuring out kind of archetypes that appear throughout art history. So, I mean, the Goya is painted, I mean, if you look at them, they could be from the same period, That's the thing about them. It's that you're just like, oh, okay, two paintings of a boy, but what's important is understanding that Goya has painted this, maybe like 100 years. When's this? 18? Oh no, 50. Is that right? 50. 50 years before. But also it's like this palette and this history here. It's important to know that Manet, this is a stage portrait of his stepson, where he's dressed his stepson in Spanish clothes from that era, to kind of pay homage or to sort of like speak to that era from 50 years later. And it's like, if you didn't know that, I think that's, to me, that's a puzzle. That's something that's so interesting to me, that you can sort of play through time and space, and you can sort of, the theatre of it, So, I mean, the model of the black palm is obviously from something like this idea of the figure holding something and speaking to something else, I think,
And this engagement with past models, and Manet, and in the late 19th century, they're obsessed with Spanish painting. They love the theatricality of it. And so when we think of 19th century French painting as just impressionism, no, there is this rigorous. There have been exhibitions dedicated to this kind of obsession with Spanish art, and absolutely, like, to think of this as a child dressed up to evoke that period, and then evoking that period through the style of painting. It's really these layers of appropriation and different levels going on there.
And it's artists thinking through the history of painting, which is something that I think through. So it's like I feel a kinship in the way that we think through the history of this medium.
Yeah.
And, with all the problems that arise of it, for me, as someone with my heritage, that is also fuel and energy for me to sort of like think about that history and a way to kind of engage with it. So, and the non-space again is something that's very much about the painter in their studio. That I feel like that's something that is important to me, this idea of the studio as a place for play or for ideas or for thinking. And that's just as important, I think, for me.
Let's finish with Velázquez, because this was our most fun moment, was looking at this work. And you can't see it here though, Chris, look, because we were studying the moustache, which if you look in the show, there are these daubs of white highlighting that are absolutely extraordinary to see. Or you can see it there on the collar a little bit, but we just stood there sort of marveling at the paint. And then Chris was telling me how he has books on Velázquez open up, that he's sort of emulating and engaging with that. So your thoughts here on...
Yeah, I mean, Velázquez for me is just like somebody that I sort of yearn to be able to paint like. It sounds, I don't know if that's sort of like an important thing, conceptually, but like as a painter and someone who like loves the medium and I mean, you have to love it to sort of be engaged with it for so long, or to kind of spend hours on a painting. And this person like is just somebody that just knows how to make paint work, and I think that that's just as important because it's the theatre of or the performance of painting itself that is important as well as the final image. So I mean, these reproductions, they're so, I mean, you can get good ones. I've even bought images from like the Prado that, they're not cheap. But so that I can like zoom right into something and just try to figure out like, how to construct a painting, or like what's enough. And, there's a kind of emotive element to painting that I'm interested in. And that comes from not just the imagery itself, but the way paint makes you feel on a canvas, the way like a gesture or like the way that a nose can be represented by just like a flick of paint. And that's enough. There's like a tension in that. There's like a slipping off point. It's like watching a egg on the edge of a window or on the edge of a ledge or something. You're kind of like, it could just slip and fall and crack, but it holds it. Like the artist has made a gesture, and it does everything that it needs to do. And I think that, for somebody that looks at paintings and loves paintings, and that's what this show's good at, is being able to spend time with those marks. And, whilst it's here, go have a look at this work and sort of see the way that, just in the corner of his arm here, it's just absolutely like washed out. Like it's just a really thin application of paint, and then it gets a little bit thicker when it hits the light. He's added a bit of white and sort of like painted it in and sort of brought that into the foreground. And, there's a shine on his nose that's just enough. And it's just like, if that was just not there, or if that was just to the left, or it just wouldn't be. And that kind of thing is the painting doing its thing for me. So, I mean, like, I go and see this work and I'm like, oh man, like, I've literally got to do this for the rest of my life to be able to like do this kind of thing.
That's a great thing.
Oh yeah, that's the energy as well.
Because wouldn't it be horrible if you thought, oh yeah, I'm finished, I've done the best
piece
thing,
of
it's
cake.
perfect, it's over now, no need to do anything.
It's refreshing to have these, and it's also something about like having a connection with people through time as well. Like, like flowing back between time through these works, and then also through time with just being in the world as a Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal person, and what it means to connect with place in that sense. There's just something that happens where you're sort of like you're standing there now, but also like experiencing all these other times all at once. And, looking at this and, being on country, they kind of do those things for me. But I mean, please look at this work.
Yeah, please. It's fantastic. But I think we have some time for some questions, if anyone would like to ask questions or make comments about everything. Chris has just spoken so eloquently about, yes.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
I noticed in, all your paintings, the predominance of yellow. Is there any significance apart from, sunshine?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with either a sort of sense of...
I'll just get you to repeat the question.
Oh, sorry.
Kind of, just so people...
I can do
Sorry.
that. So the
Sorry.
predominance of yellow.
Yeah, there's a predominance of yellow in my work, and I think some of it has to do with a particular sense of atmosphere that I'm after, like a sense of light that belongs to a place. But sometimes it's like the yellow in the black palm. That was painted yellow because that's just the way that I underpaint a painting. So sometimes there's things that, like, the atmosphere in the studio itself has like a bit of yellow, or I've used a backdrop that's a bit of fabric that's sort of that color. But it's about a sense of atmosphere. Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes. Hi.
I was just wondering, when you're talking about your family's gardens, I'm just wondering, do you feel the same way about painting European gardens as you do family gardens?
I mean, the family garden, I've not really... there's a hibiscus there that's from the family garden. I guess the family and the sense of home is, and the sense of that idea of home, and that idea of home being both in the family home and also up not further north, they're all connected. So it's like, they're just different ways of sort of viewing the same thing, or the way that particular stories or my connection to a particular place like the Torres Strait comes through a hibiscus that's planted in my family home. And, that reminds me of my mum or my grandmother putting a flower in her hair and playing the piano or something like that. So, yeah.
Rather than a big English country garden?
More so. It's again, it's a curated experience as well, because there's probably like daisies and other things in the garden as well that aren't doing that same thing. But it's also like, there's a work, for example, in the Queensland Museum. I was asked for a show that's curated there by Rihanna Patrick and Imelda Miller called Island Futures, and it's showing a kind of not just a history of the Torres Strait, but also like a looking forward. And I was asked to create a wallpaper for a particular scene or particular set that they'd put up, that was sort of talking about the way that islanders engage with heritage and culture, but in the domestic scene, in the domestic setting. And it sort of speaks to that way that islanders that don't live on country or on TI or in the islands sort of have those little things like a pearl shell or a flower or a tea towel that has frangipanis on it that reminds them of that place. And I created a wallpaper there of frangipanis called Frangipani Land, which is a song by the Mill Sisters that my mum loves. And it's in this kind of like sort of lounge room setting with like a pearl shell up there and like a lugger boat like there. And it's what's most meaningful for me is that I've had comments from like aunties or like just community members being like, oh, where can I get that? Where can I get that wallpaper? Like, and I'm like, oh, just get me one, So, and it's like, it's like that they know what that is, They see that and they know that means something. That's a trope that, the frangipani sticker's like now on the back of cars and got a bit of like a trashy connotation, but it has something in it. Those icons mean something to people, and I'm interested in that. And
It's also interesting too, isn't it, to think of like which plants are endemic to particular, like which plants are, I'm just thinking again of our Europeans, how they're gathering together flowers that normally wouldn't bloom.
belong together.
And then actually after we met last week, I went to see the Entwined exhibition, which is on in the State Library. These plants are on my mind right now. It's a great show, and it's interesting because it had this it showed the kind of colonial engagement with plants when they first arrived in Australia, and they're looking and they're like trying to figure it all out. Anyway, it's a really rich area of thinking, I think.
Yeah.
Plants, how they matter, how we they're part of our worlds, and increasingly, with climate change, these are issues that really matter. So
yeah, I think in engagement with place and that's where we need to. That's how we need to think. I think maybe this pandemic has made us think more localized, but also there are conversations that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been having and saying forever. Now we're seeing that people are saying that fire management and those kinds of things are useful, and it's well, hello, we've been saying that forever, and that idea of thinking about where we are and what country we're on and what it means to be here and being grateful and being respectful, and that's all kind of intertwined with just taking a minute and thinking about that.
Maybe one more. Yeah.
Christopher, is your island the one Eddie Marbo came from?
Yes. Yeah, Miriam.
So is that a big influence for you?
I mean, not specifically, but it's something that is all-encompassing as to what it means to sort of be from that place. Uncle Eddie's work in native title and what that means today is something that is tied to a social history for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that we still kind of navigate constantly, and it's not specifically something that I've painted something that responds to that, but it's something to do with a sense of responsibility or a sense of what it means to have that history and what it means to be a part of that community.
Well, when you think about place,
Native.
Marbo changed the history of Australia.
Totally. I mean, the deduction or the sort of of terra nullius is a huge legal sort of feat, and but I mean that's also there's been things that have sort of complicated that as things have gone forward as well. But I mean, yes, that terra nullius, land belonging to no one, complete lie. So I think that these ideas of place and thinking about where we are open up lots of different discussions about the way we engage with history, our own history as Australians, how we engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stories and communities, and
And you know what? That's the very first question I asked Chris when I met him. Remember? I said, the Eddie Mabo, was it? That was the first question I asked him. It is a great question. Maybe we have time for one more, and then we'll close up. Yeah.
What sort of direction your art will take now after the influences for depending on what you've seen in the exhibition?
I mean, I think
Great question.
there's plenty of that, but it's also a powerful thing to have that feeling, because it's something that drives me as a painter. So I mean, it's great to see. Again, technically, it's great to spend time with works to see their technique, how things are put together. Also, it just sort of reiterates particular types of archetypes that I'm interested in. But also, I do a lot of work these days with placemaking and urban design. I just got back from Cairns. I was working with community up there, Eastern Kuku-Yalanji, and those kinds of that kind of engagement with community and thinking about site specificity plus this kind of thing. That's where my head's at, always thinking about place and thinking about the way that paintings have always spoken about place in some way and how my story can fit in, or whether I just carve my own story out or something like that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your thoughts on the show. It's been wonderful to have you here for our discussion, and I look forward to more conversations with you. And thank you, everyone, for coming and for your attention.
Thank you.